Hello everyone, this is Dave from University of Florida. I'm here to present our paper on USB security. This is a collaboration with the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So USB is short for Universal Serial Bus, and I wonder if anyone still remember the old days when we need to plug in a keyboard mouse using PS2, and even better, we've got another 100 different peripheral ports like serial port, parallel port to connect with printer, scanner, or digital camera. And everything is changed after USB is invented. Nowadays, we're using USB to connect with phones, tablets, and the latest MacBook Pro has only USB Type C port. So USB supports up to 20 gigabits per second data transmission speed and up to 100 watts for power supply. But unfortunately, USB is not secure. We look at all those USB attacks and defenses in the past 20 years. And from leveraging USB device to break into the air gap for malware propagation, to maliciously modify the firmware to inject malicious functionalities, and for signal injections, for example, inject high voltage to destroy the host machine. And we look back all those attacks. We looked at 40 attacks in total, and we surveyed 30 defensive solutions together. To better understand the security issues within these attacks and defenses, we break all these solutions into different layers. From top to bottom, we have human layer, application layer, transport layer, and physical layer. So attacks at the human layer targets human beings and how they treat and handle the USB devices. Here we have outsiders attacks and insider attacks. Outsiders are vulnerable to social engineering, such as USB baiting. And we have seen so many cases where attacker just drop some random malicious USB drive in the parking lot. The most well-known insider attacks are Snowden and the Winner case, where they just plug in a typical USB drives into classified computer system to exfiltrate sensitive data. And even worse, a recent study from our co-authors dropped hundreds of different USB flash drives across the campus, and it turns out most people would pick them up and plug into their laptops. Attacks at the application layers involves the application within the host operating system and the functionality provided by the USB device. Here we have code injection, usually involves certain feature provided by the operating system, such as auto-run to install certain malware. We have seen Stuxnet. Here we have Docker, Conflict, Flame. Data exfiltration leverages the functionality of the USB device to exfiltrate data. Microsoft has been aware of this auto-run issue for years, and they added this auto-run protection since Windows 7, but still you can buy this USB device on the market which can bypass this protection and re-enable the auto-run feature again. Attacks at the transport layer involves the USB stack within the operating system and the USB device drivers. On the device side, it involves the firmware of the device. Here we have protocol masquerading and protocol corruption. Masquerading usually takes the advantage of the USB protocol to add malicious functionality into the firmware. One example is bad USB here. Here we can see this USB flash drive can inject keystroke just like a keyboard. Protocol corruption usually involves hardware or software fuzzer to exploit certain vulnerabilities within the USB software stack. We have this answer here. Physical layers involves the physical characteristics happens on the USB bus between the host machine and the device. If it's dropping, either embed certain extra hardware into the device or keyboard, or exploit certain hardware defect to launch side channel attacks. One example here is the USB snooping attack. Here, the leakage signal from the USB hub can be leveraged to launch side channel attacks against the USB traffic happened in the adjacent downstream port. Signal ejection attacks just inject higher voltage or current to destroy the host machine. The example here, again, is the USB killer, which is equipped with a bunch of capacitors. After this device is plugged into the host machine, they would try to draw power from the host controller, and once they're fully charged, they would discharge and just put your machine into fire. So in summary, we look at 40 different attacks into 8 different subcategories. The one lesson learned here is trust by default. We see like people trust this device by its appearance, and the operating system trusts this device by default as well. Another observation here is attacks transcend layers. Even the attacks happens at the transport layer or the hardware layer are still targeting the application level data or user level sensitive data. So then we look at all the defenses happen at each layer. Defenses at the human layers ranging from security training, data encryption, host authentication to auditing and physically disabling USB port. Prov USB is a typical solution for host authentication. Here, the TPM is leveraged by the Prov USB device to establish the unique identity and integrity measurement of the host machine. Within the device, each I/O operation is recorded at the block level to provide provenance. So later on, if this USB device is infected with certain malware, we can do forensic analysis using this provenance to figure out when and where does this infection happen. Defenses at the application layer has system hardening, which usually requires the installation of certain antivirus software, and driver-based access control, which treat the USB drivers as capabilities and only permit this capability based on the policy setting of this USB device. And then we have honeypots. So good USB is a typical example of driver-based access control. Here, the good USB is able to intercept the USB device and the driver loading. So before the corresponding driver is loaded, good USB is able to ask the expectation of the device from the user. So for example, if the user assumes this device is a USB flash drive, then good USB would not allow a keyboard driver to be loaded to observe this device. Defenses at the transport layers have different categories. Firmware verification usually tries to verify either the functionality or the integrity of the firmware. And then we have seen USB stack fuzzing. USB packet firewall solutions treat the USB security problem as a networking problem and trying to enforce policies on each USB packet. And then we have we have honeypots again. If you look at the USB filter architecture, it basically sits in the bottom of the USB subsystem within the kernel. In the use space, there is a tool called USB tables, which specify the policy of a certain packet, and the kernel is able to enforce this packet to specify what kind of functionality this USB device is able to perform. There are not too many defenses at the physical layer. Anti-fingerprinting randomizes the timing of the USB signaling, trying to defend against machine learning-based fingerprinting techniques. Secure channels enables an encrypted communication channel between the host machine and the device. One example is US Scramble. If you see, so the encryption happens at the controller driver layer. Before each packet is sent to the controller hardware, it is encrypted by US Scramble. Again, in summary, we look at 30 different defenses. And one observation is trust anchors represent a design trade-off. We have seen Prov USB leverage the TPM from the host machine to establish a trust, but we haven't seen such trust anchor from the device side. Single layer solutions are not effective because we have seen attacks can transcend layers. And last, defenses for signal ejection are still missing. For example, the USB killer attack. This is also reasonable because unless the host controller is equipped with overcurrent or over voltage protection, there's just no way for the software layer to defend against these kind of attacks. So we combine the taxonomy of attacks and defenses together in our systematization. The first observation here is the packet firewall and the honeypot solutions provides the best coverage across different attacks. As we mentioned before, the defense for signal injection attack is missing, but fortunately, the USB implementer forum recognized this issue and introduced the Type C authentication protocol trying to fix this problem. So there are some review comments on Amazon from a Google engineer complaining about how a miswired Type-C cable destroyed his laptops and USB analyzers. The USB IF recognized this issue and introduced Type-C authentication trying to fix this problem. Note that this is a first official response from IF to security issues related with USB. It is finalized on February 2017. So in short, it brings a CE model into the USB ecosystem. To support this CE model, there are some hardware changes needed within the device. The first change is maximum 8 different private keys and their corresponding certificate chains can be baked into this USB device. And extra crypto components are also needed, including random number generator, hashing, and signing modules. After the device is plugged into the host machine, this authentication protocol gonna start before the device is fully activated. The whole protocol works like a typical challenge response messaging protocol. The host starts with a digest query asking for certain certificate chain, and then the host reads the certificate chain from the device. And finally, the host sends out, announce, and verify the signature from the device. We realized this protocol is really important, and it had not been formally verified, so we did it using ProVerif. The first challenge comes from the difference between networking protocol and the hardware protocol, because ProVerif assumes thread as an untrusted channel, and this is usually the internet for networking protocols. But for hardware protocol, especially USB, we treat the firmware as the untrusted protocol, because we have seen the firmware changes are the most powerful attacks one can launch at the software layer. Then we need to figure out what needs to be protected. We realize all these private keys inside this USB device have to be private. Meanwhile, the certificate chains can be public. And then what about the security goals? We realize a successful authentication should guarantee the true identity of this USB device. And even more, a successful authentication should guarantee the original functionality of this device. Once we sorted out this using ProVerif, we implement the whole protocol using ProVerif, and we move on to the formal verification. So the good news is all the private keys are secure because there's no message involved within the protocol directly accessing or transferring the private key. But the bad news here is it's vulnerable to spoofing attacks. So to accelerate the authentication procedure, the spec recommends the using of certificate chain cache. If the digest of this certificate chain has been seen in this cache, the host would just skip all the following procedures of this authentication protocol and trust this device. And we think this is really bad. So we manually remove this certificate chain cache usage from our verification and rerun the verification. And it's still vulnerable to bad USB attacks. What happens here is the attacker just embed his own private key and a certificate into the firmware instead of using the ones baked into the hardware. And there are even more issues here, including no verification for the certificate, and self-signed certificates are allowed as well. We believe the Type-C authentication is really a good start, but there are a lot of things we should do to make USB secure. One direction is solution integration. We have seen like how attacks can transcend layers. It's natural to combine different solutions at different layers to provide better coverage. By the time of writing, Renesas has released a USB power delivery controller supporting the Type-C authentication. There are other bunch of software IPs supporting this protocol as well. We believe it's needed to evaluate these products as early as possible before this protocol is fully adopted by different vendors. We have seen the Type-C authentication only permits the authentication or the challenge from the host to the device. And we really want this bi-directional authentication, which means this would give billions of mobile devices a chance to establish a trust with the host machine. We also need to support the legacy devices. Two possible solutions are firmware attestation and fingerprinting, although fingerprinting may be vulnerable to adversarial machine learning techniques. Also, we need to implement the policy mentioned across the spec. Whether or not we can reuse the existing policy language like type enforcement used by SU Linux, or we need a new policy language design for USB peripherals, maybe following certain standard like XML or JSON. So in conclusion, we look at 40 attacks plus 30 defenses. We looked into USB Type C Authentication protocol, which is the future for any USB devices, and we give future directions. Thank you.
All right, so while people are getting up to the mic, I'll ask my question. So you kind of mentioned it in the paper, and if you look at the bottom of the table where you had the USB-C at the bottom of the table,
right,
and it failed to cover most of the threat vectors, if I remember correctly. But that was the first and only USB standard to incorporate a secure,
yes,
focus on security during design.
Yes.
So I would say that probably means it failed.
Yeah, maybe.
Being nice. So would you make any recommendations of how to carry out that secure design process better to cover more threat vectors? Or is there something I'm missing about maybe some of those threat vectors aren't actually critical for what USB cares about?
I mean, first of all, we have emailed USBIF about our findings, and we're still waiting for their response. But regarding whether or not we wanted the Type C authentication protocol to cover more attacks, I mean, I'm not sure, because my feeling is this protocol is triggered by these like physical issues where like it just miswired Type C cable can destroy your machines. But whether or not it can be leveled up to defend higher level attacks, I mean, it's possible, because at least this gives you a trust anchor within the device. You can always tell, like, for example, you trust a device or host controller made by this vendor. If you can build this trust, you probably can enforce certain policies. But again, like, this just trusted, it's maybe not trustworthy.
So you mentioned trust anchor, but it seems like you're able to usurp the trust anchor by writing your own firmware.
Yes.
And creating your, so you're motivating probably then you have hardware protections on the trust anchor so that once a device is sold from a manufacturer, you can't overwrite a certain like TPM style, but for USB devices.
Right. I mean, ideally, the firmware should not be reprogrammed, because then basically you give the attacker opportunities to do a lot of crazy stuff. But as we have seen, like, people just can't do that. So.
Okay, great. Everybody, let's thank Dave for a great talk.
Thank you.